Order, and welcome to the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, where we welcome Ofgem as part of our ongoing review and scrutiny of the work of the department and its arm's length bodies. So welcome to Chief Executive Jonathan Brearley, Director General Tim Jarvis, Director General Akshay Kaul, and Director for Retail Pricing and Systems, Charlotte Friel. You are all very welcome. Now, Jonathan Brearley, I know you want to make an opening statement. I'll ask you to consider the following question in making that opening statement. There is much discussion about your role in setting the price cap.
Yes.
Whose responsibility should it be to set energy prices in this country? Should it be Ofgem's or should it be the government's?
Great question. Well, thank you, Chair. And I'll just launch into a few things I'd like to say in advance of that. First of all, we're really pleased to be giving evidence for the first time to this committee under your chairmanship. As a regulator, you know we report to Parliament and in effect we report to you. So we look forward to working with all of you over the coming years. Now, as Ofgem, we are here to protect customers in today's market, but also to support the transition to net zero, or as the Secretary of State described, the government's mission to become a clean energy superpower. Now, when I think about that role, I generally start with where customers are today. And we know that still, given the cost of living crisis, things for many are very difficult. Now, although prices are around 10% lower than they were a year ago, the price cap increased by £21. And because we are seeing further increases in the international gas market, unfortunately, we think we are likely to see further price rises in April. Now, having spoken to many customers, I know and you know that many are going to find this extremely challenging, both in the household sector and in the business sector. And within that context, we are working hard to protect customers today. So, for example, we have stabilised the market and improved the financial resilience of retailers, protecting customers against the costs that appeared in 2021 and learning the lessons from the gas crisis. We're working to improve service standards, and although there is a lot more to do, we are seeing increases in customer satisfaction. We are adapting our pricing regulation. I will come to your question, Chair, about whether we should be doing this. For example, offering low and zero standing charge options potentially in the future. And within our powers, we're working on a series of things we can do to protect vulnerable customers, such as rules around company behaviour, reducing PPM tariffs, and quite radical proposals around how we might help the industry address the debt problem. But I do need to be clear as a regulator, there are limits on what we can do. So we are keen to pursue with government options to focus targeted support at those who are most vulnerable to energy price rises. And that is part of the problems we face today. But there's another underlying truth which the Secretary of State put forward when he came to this committee. Right now, we rely heavily on the international gas market. Now, unless we transform our energy infrastructure, we will remain dependent on volatile international gas prices, which again have leapt over the last few months. Therefore, we're working hard with government to support the drive to deliver clean power by 2030, and also to make sure the market, when we get there, is fit for purpose for customers. That clearly means building out networks, fixing the connections issue, creating the right incentives for customers to be able to move their demand, and also taking advantage of the economic opportunities, particularly given the conversations we've had with the Chancellor within the recent weeks. And look, this is going to be a decade of change, I hope, and I expect that it will be. And that's change for the sector, but that also means change for Ofgem itself. So we welcome the Ofgem review because we want to see a debate about our duties. We want to ask Parliament what you would like us to do and focus on. And equally, we think we need new powers in a market where energy is bought and sold and used very differently. So look, before I finish, I'm just less than 2 weeks away from my first 5 years as CEO. I'm very grateful for all the hard work from the teams across Ofgem, and despite the challenges, I'm very proud of the work they do and the positive impact they have for customers. But I do want to finish where I started. We're here to protect customers today, but also to play our part in building that system for the future, and I look forward to working with the committee as we do. Now, in terms of pricing, in terms of who should set pricing, in a sense, within the mandate that we have, I don't think it's an unreasonable thing for a regulator to do, but you need to understand what we control and what we don't control. So within the formula that we use, the margin in the price cap, so the regulated profit that a supplier might make, is about 2.5%. The rest of those features are essentially cost analysis, so they're a technical job reflecting the way the market is. And as I said before, when I think about the way prices change, a lot of it is not only outside of Ofgem's control, quite frankly, Chair, it's outside of government's control, and it's really based on events in international markets, which is why we see the volatility we've seen over the last few years, given the geopolitical situation and the situation within the gas market. So I don't think it is wrong for the regulator to do it, but I think you need to know the price cap is not a limit on prices in the same way you might imagine it is. It is a reflection of the cost of the market, and those will change.
Okay, it's almost as if you were expecting the question. Congratulations on your reappointment, by the way. I should have said that before I asked you to give your opening statement. Now, I know Chris Chope, I don't know if you want to ask the question you indicated to me before, because Mr. Brearley hinted at it.
You as a regulator, recently had a meeting with other regulators. What was it, with the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Yes.
And can you tell us what transpired and how you were able to say to the Chancellor of the Exchequer that electricity and energy prices are fundamental to our ability to grow as a nation, and at the moment we have got the highest electricity prices in the Western world. So surely that is very inhibiting in terms of growth. So what were you able to say to the Chancellor about what you're going to do to ensure that we become a low-cost energy superpower?
Well, in a sense, there were 5 things we put forward to the Chancellor, and they're really divided into 2 areas. First of all, how you secure investment in the sector, and how you make sure that happens at pace, and frankly, how you make sure the regulator isn't a blocker to that. Now, as the Secretary of State laid out last week, we agree that the best pathway to more stable prices is to move to one where you have a net zero system, simply because the costs that you put into the system are the capital you spend up front, and they're not dependent on the markets that we see around us. But to go through the 5 things, first of all, it is making sure we play our part in getting investment for Clean Power 2030. We agree that we need to resolve the connections issue, because when investors come to this country, one of their principal issues when investing in the energy market is being able to get connected to the grid. And we do think we need a more dynamic retail market to do exactly that, to make sure that for all customers, both businesses and households, they have the ability to minimise their costs in a system where you are going to see more intermittent renewables in the future. But then coming down to how do you make this energy system attractive for investors, there are 2 further things. First of all, making sure that factories, when they arrive here, can connect to the grid. But then secondly, there is a conversation we would like to have about industrial costs. There is a scheme already where government, for example, exempts some of the industry from some of the costs that are in the system, but that obviously comes with trade-offs both for the taxpayer and indeed for other consumers. But in terms of minimising cost, we are full square behind getting to 2030, because we think that is the best way to avoid some of the costs we've seen in the last 2 years. And look, I sat with businesses through the crisis. I sat with small businesses facing massive increases in their bills. All of that was driven by the volatility we see in the gas market.
It's also the extent of the gas prices. I mean, you haven't really mentioned the word growth in your answer. If the Chancellor really wants to go for economic growth, what are you saying you're going to be able to do to help deliver that by reducing our overall costs of energy, particularly to industry? Because at the moment we are exporting industry overseas because of the very high energy costs we've got here. Surely this should be the number 1 priority for your organisation.
So we are absolutely focused on reducing costs in the overall system. Now that is about designing a market where you can get to 2030. That is about making sure that we move away from this country, including this industry's dependence on gas. And in the long term, that's where you want to get to, and we are full square behind that. And quite frankly, that is a huge part of not just Ofgem's, but the government's growth mission. But equally, alongside that, there is a short-term question about how we distribute costs, and I think we should be mindful of all the investors that want to come and invest in this system and get the right industrial prices as well.
Thank you very much. So it sounds like the discussion is around how regulation can contribute to growth, and there's an ongoing discussion to be had there. How has the change of government and having the mission-oriented approach, I think, at least to that 2030 goal, impacted on your work?
Well, I'll kick off, but I'll ask Akshay to come in and just take you through the detail. I mean, the first thing to say is by having the clarity of goal that we have, and quite frankly, I think the really impressive work the department have done to lay out the action plan that came out towards the end of last year, I do think across the industry, including for the regulator, we have a set of clearly definable tasks that we're able to deliver against. Now, there's all sorts of delivery risks, and I'm sure Akshay will expand on where we think we need help from government to make them work. But I think the to-do list is clear. The role for Ofgem, in my mind, is two things. It's, first of all, to make sure that finance can flow, but also to make sure customers get out of this system what they were promised. So Akshay regularly says to me, on time and on budget are going to be the mantra, not just for the network industry, but for all the industry that are building for 2030. But over to you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the biggest thing I think the Clean Power Mission has done is to produce a system plan where all the numbers add up to a clean power target, and the entire community, the government, the regulator, the system operator and the industry are clear about what we're aiming for in terms of different types of technologies, so how much wind, how much solar, how much battery, how much long duration storage, what our respective roles are, and what are the timescales in which we need to achieve all that. And this isn't just a system plan that's a sort of nice document or a brochure, to wave around at conferences. We're going to directly use the Clean Power Action Plan to reorder the connections queue. So the connections queue will then contain the things that are needed in order to run a safe and secure system for 2030. And I think that is a big step forward from the relatively uncoordinated system that we used to have, a market-led system that we used to have, which has produced all of the problems that we see, the long connection queues and the high congestion costs.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Of course.
Is it possible to do this in time for the government to hit the Clean Power 2030 target?
It is a very considerable challenge. And from an Ofgem perspective, we have four main areas that we're working on to enable Clean Power 2030. The first is to solve the connections problem, and we think that is eminently doable. Once we have the Clean Power Action Plan, we can now reorder the queue, and that reform is underway, and we can talk a bit more about that if you wish. The second one is to get all the network built by 2030. There are about 80 projects in the plan that are critical to the achievement of that target. Of those, 9 have already been built, so that leaves about 71. And 68 out of those 71 are currently on track. 3 are not currently on schedule for 2030, and we need to accelerate them. We need to work with the government to accelerate them. And the big challenge there, Chair, if I can just orient the timescales for the committee, is that 2030 is just 5 years away. So if it takes 3 or 4 years to build these physically build the network, all of these projects need to get planning consent by the end of 2026. And that's going to mean a significant acceleration in their procurement and consenting within the existing planning system. And I know that the government very much has this in its sights. The third area is long-duration energy storage. We don't have a lot of it. We only have about 2.8 gigawatts. And we've seen this winter, when you have a period of cold, still, cloudy weather, the batteries on their own and the interconnectors on their own are not sufficient. So we're going to need to set up a brand new regime, a cap and floor regime, to attract the private capital into long-duration energy storage and get these assets built by 2030. Now, again, that is quite a considerable challenge to physically get things like big pumped hydro schemes built in the time available, but we relish it. We're up for the challenge. And then finally, the fourth area where we're working on, which is probably the hardest of all the four, is, but also possibly from a consumer perspective, the most rewarding, is consumer flexibility, which is the idea that consumers can essentially be rewarded for moving their consumption from a time where you have peak demand to a time where the system is less stressed. And the reason that is a challenge is that we need to bring all the market arrangements and infrastructure and systems together across a range of different organizations and then engage with the public to get enough of the flexible demand response back into the system. The scale of the challenge is to go from 2 gigawatts that we have now to 12, so a sextupling of the resource that is available to us.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of questions that my colleagues are primed to ask as follow-ups to what we've heard already, so I will encourage them to do so. Now, I think Claire Young's going to ask a direct follow-up and then move on to a separate topic.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm going to talk about grid connections reform, but before I do, I just want to pick up on the issue of the reprioritisation of the queue. And obviously, you can't reprioritise yourself out of a problem if there just isn't enough total capacity? So even if you reorder the queue, does your queue still extend? Does it extend beyond the timeline you need for delivering clean power by 2030?
We have more than enough capacity in the queue. There's about 750 gigawatts is the size of the queue. And even in the most ambitious scenarios, we don't think we need more than 200 or 220 gigawatts on the system. It's a question of really weeding out the projects that are speculative and really not making any progress, that are blocking the real projects that need to be connected to the system.
Those connections can be provided quickly enough?
And they can be. Yeah. I think we're pretty confident once we clear up the queue, they can be.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mean capacity of the network?
I'm talking about the capacity to deliver new connections.
Yeah, so that you need both the queue reorganisation and the new build together to be able to do it.
So moving on to grid connections reform and your role in that, you're due to make a significant decision on NESO's proposals for connections reform, and as a presumption that you'll approve them. Why should Ofgem, rather than NESO, ultimately be responsible for this process?
So the NESO is the connection service provider, and they operate the connection service to standards that are established by us as their regulator, and Ofgem is the rule maker. And what we have to make sure is that the proposals that are being put forward by the NESO are transparent, they're fair, they're proportionate, and ultimately that they're in the interests of consumers. And we think that this is a healthy check and balance. So the NESO is the technical body. They are working with the industry to develop the proposals, and Ofgem as the rule maker is able to balance consumer and industry interests and arrive at a overall view.
Sorry to interrupt. Just in that answer, there's this, the fact we were even asking the question kind of points to one of the challenges here, which is the confusion amongst the public and amongst consumers. Is there a way of making this simpler and communicating better, the way that you interrelate with NESO and indeed with the department?
Look, I think it's valid to say now we have NESO, Ofgem and the department in this space that there is still work to do to work through the institutional relationships. But the way I see it is, the department set the policy and the strategy. We should be implementing that, but making the economic trade-offs for customers and between different customer outcomes. And NESO's job is to provide the advice for that plan in the first place, but then to also support delivery through their technical work. Now, when you get down into the weeds, there will be over time debates about where our boundary sits, and there's things that we do and things that they do are fairly similar. But that's the principles I'd lay out as a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, you made a very good point before about consumers and taking them with and getting them to engage.
Yes.
With this very, very important aspect of demand flexibility. The communication part of this is huge, isn't it?
I completely agree, and actually it's funny, I think we would like to take a stronger role in communicating things to customers. So, for example, Charlie here has been working to explain about some of the issues around meters predominantly in Scotland and how those might be changed. And I do think there is a bigger role Ofgem can play, which isn't our traditional role, to actually get out there and explain how some of this works to customers.
Look forward to the Ofgem roadshow, virtual or in person.
Yes, we might hire a good-looking front person, not myself.
Good, back to Claire. Yeah.
Is it right for government to be taking control of future connection offers through the deployment targets and their clean power plan, or is that backpedalling on the principle that the energy system should be independently regulated?
So I think there is a genuine discussion. So we talked about the Ofgem review, and I talked about some of the things we'd like to have a debate about. One of them is about what role you'd like Ofgem to have in a world where the government is producing a strategic plan. So it doesn't make sense at first look to have a regulator that's got a different strategy to the one that the government has laid out. However, I think the world has the energy system has a much stronger sense of direction now we have that plan in place. Now, I've been involved in electricity markets and energy market reform for over 15 years now, and I think what we've always lacked, including for Ofgem, is a sense of the direction this market is going in. So there is a compromise there. We have to be honest. Government is much more in this market than it was 5 years ago, but that sense of direction in my mind is incredibly valuable if you want to move at pace and if you want to make the sorts of changes government wants to make.
The government said that they will introduce legislation when parliamentary time allows to ensure connection reform allies with the strategic energy and network plans and supports the delivery of clean power by 2030. do you have an idea of when you need that to happen, given that they're being fairly vague on timings?
I think the government has said that they're supportive of bringing in legislation if that is necessary. I think what we're doing at the moment is working through the industry code modification process to get the new connections regime in place by the end of this year. And our base case scenario is that will just go through. So we won't necessarily need legislation to make that work. The reason the backstop is helpful is because, essentially we will be reordering projects that have strong commercial interests to be in the queue or to be ahead of others. And there is always a risk of legal opposition to these sorts of reforms. And that's where having a backstop of the legislation is incredibly helpful.
Next question. We know that decarbonising energy systems will require significant local action. However, there's still a lack of a clear framework for the involvement of local authorities and local area energy plans, and how these fit in or are considered. So can you explain Ofgem's vision for inclusion and empowerment of local authorities in energy planning?
Yeah, this is a really, really big area for us. So we've been talking so far about the Clean Power Action Plan and the connections queue. All of this is happening at the national transmission level. But we know that the net zero transition is going to play out hugely at a local level with solar power, with EVs and with heat pump rollouts, and also changes to the housing stock. So in addition to creating the apparatus for national system planning, one of our flagship regulatory initiatives has been to introduce a similar framework for regional system planning, working with the local authorities, businesses in each of the areas, and the NESO, to try and get coherent regional system plans that reflect the ambitions of local authorities in their area and allow both the transmission and distribution grids to anticipate and respond to them.
Finally, we've heard that the government's heavy reliance on the distribution networks for solar generation is, I quote, wildly unrealistic. Do you have any concerns about the level of industry consultation undertaken in developing these plans, either by NESO or the government?
Do you mean the increase in the solar capacity in the Clean Power Action Plan?
No, I think it's about it's about the increase, but how that relies on the distribution networks. It's specifically it's not about not being able to do the projects quickly enough. It's about how that depends on the distribution networks.
So two things I would say. First of all, we have a similar but not on the same scale investment challenge with those local networks. So they are going to have to ramp up very quickly. It's quite area and regional dependent, so the Southwest has a lot of solar within it. But both as we've done on the national level, we're now doing through the local network sort of regulatory processes, making sure they have access to the funding and finance available. There then comes a second question, which is about their capacity to deliver. And there are two dimensions for me. One is, these companies getting their projects up and running on time to be able to connect people quickly enough. And there is a general question around local networks, around their kind of service delivery, so how they interact with what we see as their customers, so solar developers, charger developers, etc. And both of those areas we're focusing on in terms of our regulation.
We're hearing examples from around the country, Jonathan Brearley, about organisations who are installing their solar in quite decent amounts, and they're having to wait. They're being given dates years in the future before they get connection to the distribution network. Are you going to be able to sort this out?
So that is all part of the connections process that Akshay describes, but I think I'd go beyond that. I think we need DNOs to take a more proactive stance. So the technical problem will be solved, but this is also about how they approach their customers and how they deliver for them.
And Sharon, underappreciated fact is, 2/3 of the queue at the distribution level is actually constrained by the transmission system right now. So if we clear up the transmission level queue, it will unlock a huge amount of capacity at the distribution grids.
Thank you very much. We've finished. Okay. You mentioned in your opening remarks, Jonathan Brearley, both the price cap and standing charges. I think Polly Billington's got some more detailed questions.
Thank you very much, Chair, and apologies for my lateness.
What more can be done to ensure domestic customers are not paying more than they need to for energy, and that they're given a greater sense of agency over their energy bills, do you think?
Shall I kick off, and then perhaps I'll try to talk a little bit about some of the specific things we're doing on standing charges. And it comes back, I think, really to where the chair started about the role of the price cap. I mean, I think that the price cap is the main mechanism by which we can actually try and bear down on costs in the system and try and reduce them as far as possible for consumers, to the extent that those costs are within the control of us as the regulator. And I think if you look back at the history of the price cap, it was brought in to try and protect those customers who were not switching and not taking advantage of offers on the market and potentially being sort of effectively ripped off by suppliers who were at the expense of everybody else.
I think it took a crisis in the Ukraine for the government to decide that might be the case. I'm just making that observation.
So
I've been in this field for a long time.
Yeah.
And I have had people telling me that switching was going to be that we're supposed to like transform the agency of consumers, and it hasn't. So now we've got the cap. Is that what we're saying?
So the price cap actually predates the Russia-Ukraine invasion. I think it came under a lot of strain during it. That's why I think we had to introduce a lot of changes into the market. And I think there remains this question about what sort of market are we looking for here, and in terms of switching, what's the right level of switching, and how do we protect those that don't. You asked about the sort of control and agency that people have over their bills, and look, I think this was a really strong theme of the consultation we did on standing charges. But so the price cap can set an overall ceiling, if you like, on the price, but what sits underneath that and people's individual needs under that vary hugely, and that's where I think it does come under strain. So when you think about how do we deal with affordability challenges, how do we make sure that those who are really struggling to pay, we can target support to them, the price cap is not an effective mechanism for that. But perhaps, Charlie, if you might want to pick up where we've got to on standing charges and how we're looking to bring in changes there to give people exactly the agency and control that I think you referred to.
Yeah, so as Tim rightly says, we've consulted very extensively on standing charge reform, as we absolutely recognise the frustration that many people feel as the level of the electricity standing charge in particular has risen in recent years. We have had an unprecedented response. About 30,000 customers and broader stakeholders have responded, and what we're hearing loud and clear is the challenge that there are vulnerable consumers on both ends of the standing charge debate. Now, some of what we hear is just get rid of them, some is make them lower, some is just that I want more control over how I manage this. What those charges cover are the fixed costs of the system. So, call centres, IT in some cases, the wires, the electricity wires that we've just talked about that move power around the system. So we can't make them go away. They are a part of providing energy to households and businesses. But we can move them around the bill, and we considered this really extensively last year. The challenge that we face, of course, is that there's not a strong correlation in particular between energy usage and income. So where we considered potentially reducing them from the fixed charge and putting them onto the unit rate, we recognise that there would be many vulnerable households who could be really harmed by this, and we had disability charities and citizens' advice, for example, really urging us not to go down that road, or at least approach with caution. But what we are able to do here is recognise that whilst we might not be able to move costs around the system quite so freely with the affordability support that's currently available, we can offer more choice. So what customers want is that ability to control. If they are turning down their energy use, they will see a benefit in their bill. And so we recognise that perhaps giving an option where most of the costs are on the unit rate allows that empowerment, and that's what we're consulting on at the moment, or are shortly due to next month, is introducing an additional tariff under the price cap that offers a low or zero standing charge option. The only other thing I would say is that many options already exist in the fixed tariff market if customers are willing and interested to take a one-year fix, for example, or purchase additional services. There are already low standing charge offers out there between sort of 12 and 30% reductions on the existing standing charge.
But this is tinkering around the edges. We had the Committee on Climate Change in the other day, and their number one recommendation was a significant rebalancing of energy retail costs between gas and electricity. Mm-hmm. What is your view on that?
So, look, ultimately, that is a trade-off that the Treasury and the Secretary of State are going to have to make. I know why the Committee on Climate Change want it. I understand the argument, and the argument is perfectly legitimate that if you are moving a lot of the economy onto electricity, as we plan to do so, having all of the levies attached to the very thing you want people to move on to does not make sense from an incentive perspective. But as the Secretary of State said when he was here, there are big distributional consequences. And
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but you're the regulator. You're the one that was supposed to be worrying about that equity, so have you got some ideas for it?
Well, and we are, but I mean, just to come back to your first point about how we give more choice and agency to customers, the reason we brought in low standing charge options is to allow people to be able to optimise themselves. We did look, as Charlie says, about making a sweeping change across the board, but once again, you make people better off and worse off. Now, I think for all of these things, part of the reason that we think targeted support is necessary is not just because of the outcomes for those customers and what they need, which I think is pretty big right now, but it's also, it allows you to make some of these changes that have distributional consequences. So actually, I'd argue as a regulator, that is one thing we can't do, which is move money between different sorts of customers. Ultimately, that has to be done under policy guidance, and the War Home discount is set by the department.
You will need to start exploring the implications of that.
Absolutely.
And what would that do for the way that you have the pricing structures?
We will, and we're working very closely with the department to do that. But it comes back to, if you had a system where you had more targeted support at those you were concerned about, you would have more flexibility to make some of the more economically rational choices you might want to make.
So, would it make sense in those circumstances? Should, for example, a future Secretary of State, if not the current one, choose to do that, ask for that electricity market reform so that we were rebalancing between electricity and gas and was trying to address the distributional issues, would you be in favour of a social tariff, for example, in order to be able to protect vulnerable?
We've said for a number of years we would like a serious look at a social tariff. Ultimately, there's a limit to how much a regulator can recommend policy. We've probably gone as far as we can, so we are enthusiastic about the idea.
What do you make of Nesta's proposals for rebalancing the levies?
Well, I mean, look, I think the Secretary of State laid it out very clearly last week. In a sense, you can all see the rationality of doing so. You can see it's the right thing to do from a perspective of getting to net zero. But if you don't have a plan to deal with the distributional consequences, then you have a lot of people losing out, just like we have in our standing charge consultation. So this is why I think you need a more holistic approach to those who are struggling to pay their bills.
Luke Murphy.
Just a few questions in addition. One is just, does that include working with the department to think through the consequences of things like locational pricing?
Yes.
Yeah. And then secondly, within what proposals you might come up with for the cap, does the current Act allow you to make the change, provide you with the flexibility for whatever changes you might want to make, or does it require amendment legislation?
Well, I might just kick off, but hand over to Akshay in more detail on the zonal pricing. So one of the lead options the government has identified. So we are, there's a big debate on our board. This isn't a unanimous issue, but broadly we are very supportive of moving to a system that has zonal pricing. We think it improves efficiency. We think there are ways in which you can deal with some of the regional inequalities that might result. So there are ways of rebalancing that to make sure you don't have big regional disparities, and we think for the long-term running of the system that might make sense. But ultimately, again, this is a matter for ministers to decide, and something that I know that they're thinking through. Actually, there's nothing else on zonal pricing, but Tim, you might want to come back on.
Yeah, I'll come back on the cap
options.
Maybe only to say, I think we've published our own assessment of locational pricing in October of 2023. And essentially we concluded that it would produce benefits for consumers through a better operation of batteries and interconnectors. But there are risks to both investment in terms of disruption that a market reform would cause, and there are risks that are produced for renewable generation, which would need to be mitigated. And we're certainly, as Jonathan said, confident that those risks can be mitigated. It just needs to be done carefully.
Do you want me to pick up on the cap? I mean, so we put out a consultation last year. I mean, I think there are three things about the cap within the current legislation that we need to think about. So one is that it's flat across the market, and one is it's universal to all suppliers. And we also have at the moment quite a stringent cap because of the pressure that everybody's got on their bills at the moment. I think when we are looking at reforms that we might need to make as you move to this much more flexible world and different times of day and prices in different times of day and ability for people to flex, and how can you change the cap within that? I think there are some things we can do within the current legislation, but I think if you wanted to look at quite radical reform about sort of setting different caps for different types of customers, then we'd probably be looking to the department to make legislative change.
Thank you very much. Mike Reader.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming in today. I recognise this is your first time in front of this committee, but you've been in front of planes before, and I've 2022 in the front of the Bays Committee, you were asked if you were on the side of the consumer or on the side of energy companies. You said you were very much on the side of the consumer, whereas today we've heard that you've talked around a balance of driving investment and supporting the market and protecting consumers. How much actually do you think the government's growth mission is driving you to not focus solely or put most of your focus on consumer debt, and actually you're being driven to drive more money into the market?
Well, I think first I'd say as an organisation, everything that we do is focused on customers. And, Charlie may want to expand on this, but we are doing extensive work on trying to mitigate debt, and we have, as I say, pretty much stretched the edge of our powers to deal with that, which we can come on to. What I described in those areas, so for example, the areas of getting investment into the sector, etc., are all about getting to the destination of Clean Power 2030. And, like the Secretary of State, I have lived and worked in the regulator through the crisis in the last 2 years. I have seen the detrimental impact that relying on an international market with, frankly, huge geopolitical dependencies, and I've seen the damage that has done to this country. So without a doubt, I think it is not only in companies' interest in terms of building all this stuff, but in consumers' interest to make sure that we get there, and we get there quickly and efficiently. Just to say, although we are getting on very well with investors right now, I'm absolutely sure in a year or two's time, when we are holding them to account for the progress they need to make, things will probably get a bit more frictionful and a bit more frosty.
Do you think that gives confidence to my constituents now that they're going to see their energy bills reducing? Because they've heard for years from government that things will get better in the future. We're now talking about 2030 as the next milestone, but actually people are seeing their debt continue to rise and costs continue to rise. So do you think they can trust that you're going to deliver for them?
Look, I can understand why, and I spend a lot of time talking to different customers in different circumstances, and I hear the same thing that you hear, which is, deep disappointment that we've seen, despite £50 billion-ish or £40 billion going into the market to subsidise customers, we saw bills double. I mean, I've never seen that in my 25 years, roughly, in this industry. So, of course, people are going to be asking questions. But I can't think of any other infrastructure strategy that is going to get us away from that dependency. So, over time, I do expect things to stabilise, and I'm hopeful that we deliver. But look, it's not down to Ofgem. It's down to the government and the sector to be able to do that on behalf of customers. We will play our part in pushing them.
Well, on that, on your website, you do recognise that government sets the policy and you help deliver it. But you say where we think there are important policy gaps that affect consumers, we'll call this out. Yes. So, can you give us some examples of how you have called that out?
Let's pick up on that because. Look, so we're very conscious of the affordability challenge in the market at the moment, and look, as you would expect, we hear this from consumers a lot. I think we've really stretched our remit as far as we can in lots of ways. I mean, for example, we've now ensured that prepayment meter tariffs are the cheapest tariffs on the market. We've required suppliers to provide additional credits to customers that are at risk of going off supply. And as an answer to your specific question, we have looked at what we have seen in the market over the last few years, which is a huge increase in customer debt as a result of the high prices we've had. Now, frankly, we think this is a bit unsustainable. We have put forward a proposal, which Charlie can give you some more detail on, about how we might have a one-off intervention to try and get some of that debt down, target some of the support of people who are carrying really high levels of debt, and as a result struggling to heat their homes now because of the debt they're carrying. And I think that there is a case for that sort of intervention, and we're going to need support from government to underwrite it, but I think this is a proposal that we put out there as something which we think would make a big difference to the market.
Before we move, can I just highlight 3 areas where we've called out gaps in government policy in the past. So you may recognise from the things I've said in 2022, when we saw the dramatic rise in price rises, when we had, at that time, no Prime Minister, and I was announcing £3,500 bills for the country, we called for the government to act to tackle that. We've been on record for a number of years around targeted support for vulnerable customers. And we, like a number of people, are saying on the infrastructure side, if we don't fix planning, if we don't have better work with the supply chain, we're not going to get to the goals that we've just described.
So there's quickly now.
I was just going to follow up on...
Could you go through the chair, please?
Sorry, Chair. I was just interested in that, because when we asked the Secretary of State last week what could he do now to help people with their bills, he basically just said there wasn't much in the short term to be done. So he will need a set of proposals from you, pretty sharpish, I would suggest, including perhaps some recommendations that if you're talking about rescheduling or cancelling debt or whatever, the people who are in the most trouble get something that stops them from ending up in that pickle again.
We are working with government on those issues.
Thank you.
So, final question for me. Current debt levels, your December report, are 3.82 billion. At what level does debt need to get to before you think government needs to take a more serious intervention? Because I think we've talked about we're tinkering with some ideas, but at some point there's got to be a much more serious intervention to protect consumers. What point is that going to come at?
Do you want to talk about the debt relief support scheme?
Yeah, so you rightly highlight that debt reached a peak of 3.8 billion towards the end of last year, and that's doubled in the last 2 years, almost entirely as a result of the high prices we saw in the energy crisis.
Your report says a 91% increase in the last 2 years. It's much more than doubled.
Yes, there's a difference between some of those that are on repayment plans and not, but it has risen from about 2 billion to almost 4. And
Doubling. Yeah. 91% is doubling.
Yes, it is.
That's probably my bad maths.
The technical team will be back on in half an hour.
So what we recognise is that is an unsustainable level of debt for customers, but it is not good for the market either. It is not good for market resilience, and left unmitigated could present huge challenges that would drive additional costs into this market for all consumers. We saw the impacts of market resilience concerns in the last couple of years and the bill impact that's had. And that's exactly why we published some of the thinking that we set on our debt strategy at the end of last year. One of the biggest challenges we see of that debt is that 75% of it is held by around 2 million households, most of whom are not on repayment plans. Now, we know from, I've spent a lot of time with debt advice charities and some of real experts in this area who are looking at people not just in energy debt but in a multitude of debts. They want to be able to pay their bills in most cases, but they are struggling under such a mountain of debt that we are seeing from this crisis that they have no way out. And so they disengage from the market, and that is the challenge we're dealing with, trying to reach these households and get them re-engaged. So that's why we have perhaps gone a bit further in the proposals that we set out at the end of last year. The debt relief scheme, which is a proposal at this stage, and we are consulting on whether it is the right thing to do, would look to provide debt relief to a subset of households who are really struggling. We are looking at different ways of assessing sort of affordability metrics and how to make sure that eligibility criteria is tackling the people that need it most. But this would provide debt relief, in some cases perhaps debt matching payments, to encourage those who are struggling to contribute towards their debt and bring them back into the system, reducing costs for all households.
Can I just sort of just lift it up a level slightly? So that point we think is very close, if not now. So come back to your question, do we need to intervene to tackle debt? We think we do. We put out a proposal that basically says we want to find some money that you'd be able to put into the system that would allow companies to be able to, for example, match fund or write off debt, to move away from this place where we are strategically. So we've got this stock left over from the crisis. The aim is both to get the industry in a sustainable position, but more importantly, that gets customers back on an even keel who otherwise would be able to manage on a day-to-day basis. Now, we need help from government to implement that scheme, but that is something we're very keen to do.
Thanks very much. Luke Murphy.
I've got some questions about kind of involuntary installations of prepayment meters, but I just wanted to ask, given the level of crisis, and you just talked about the rise in consumer debt levels, when you look back over the crisis over the last few years, is there anything that you look back on and you think Ofgem should have done differently that would have lessened the impact on consumers? Because you must look back and think, well, there are things we could learn lessons from. What would you have done differently?
I mean, post-2021 and through reports to other select committees, we talked about, I think, two major things. You mentioned involuntary installation of PPMs, and Tim could explain what we've done since then. But the two areas for me, one is the collapse of the retailers in 2021, and without a doubt, we've accepted and we've now implemented the need for a regime to maintain financial resilience. So we have a very light touch version of what happens with the banks now. We look at how much money companies are holding and we make sure that they are not so economically vulnerable, because those costs ultimately, when they go bust, get socialised amongst other customers. And my main reflection on PPM is that, you always have this debate as a regulator between a principles regulation, which talks in broad terms about what you expect, and very, very detailed rules. I think the thing I would like us to have done earlier is to have developed the detailed rules we developed in the last 2 years around installation of PPMs. Because right now it's very clear what the company should do, and I think, quite frankly, there was too much interpretation of what those broad principles suggested. Now, we are investigating companies, we are looking back at their behaviour against that broad assessment. But for me, the lesson for me of the last 5 years has been moving from a retail market that was considered to be a market and therefore the regulator cleared up around the edges and into one where the regulator is setting much more of a direction for the outcomes we want to seek. It's about prepayment meters, it's about answering the phones, it's about some of the basics and making sure companies are clear of what good looks like and are delivering against it.
What difference do you think the rules on involuntary installation has had?
Shall I pick that up? So, we introduced new rules. We had, as you may know, I think the first thing Ofgem did was we put in a moratorium on installations, and during that period we designed a new set of rules, working very closely with debt charities. They're now part of people's licence conditions. They are very prescriptive. So, for example, there's the categories of customers that we say that you should not install a prepayment meter without the consent of the household. So that includes, for example, families with children under the age of 2. It includes households where everyone in the house is over the age of 75, for example, and as you'd expect, it includes people with sort of long-term or health conditions. We've also set very strict rules about the processes that suppliers need to go through before they can actually get a warrant. So, for example, we require that they need to make at least 10 attempts to contact a household. It needs to be different types of contact. So some people respond to emails, some people will respond to letters, phone calls. And we also, that includes a welfare visit. So an actual visit to the property, and that visit has to be filmed or recorded. And likewise, when they get to the stage of getting to a warrant, again, that warrant visit is recorded. And at any point in that process, that can be paused. What we have done with the suppliers is we have required them to demonstrate to us that they've got the right systems and processes to meet those rules. And where we've been satisfied that they have, we've given them permission to restart. We've had 11 suppliers restarting. They are, quite rightly, in my view, taking a very cautious approach. So starting off with a few, and we're testing and we're monitoring very carefully. We're looking at body cam footage. We're looking
what's their coverage in terms of proportion of customers?
So we've got about 11 suppliers. So most of the market, I would say, so I'm trying to think in the proportion of the market. I suppose you've got the biggest supplier who has not restarted is British Gas, but most of the other large suppliers have restarted.
Yep.
They're under an investigation.
We have an enforcement case against British Gas at the moment, and it is up to them, I think, in terms of the restart, for them to come to us and sort of say.
Can I pick up on that point? How well? What's your assessment of how well these rules are being followed? How are you policing them?
So we are. I have a team on this that are scrutinising this, as you would expect, really, really closely. I think it's fair to say that the suppliers also recognise that they have a huge responsibility here. They are taking this very, very seriously. They're putting a lot of resource into it. So,
why do you think British Gas haven't then? Because presumably those that have been approved, the 11 that have, presumably are taking it seriously. Do you think British Gas are taking it seriously?
Well, so British Gas haven't restarted, to be fair. So it's up to them. I think to if they want to come to us and sort of say they want to restart and demonstrate that they can meet the rules, then we will do that sort of separate from the enforcement action. But so it's not that they're not taking it seriously, they're not doing it at the moment. I think the ones that have restarted are taking it very, very seriously. We are monitoring it very, very closely. I mean, what I would say about this is, I am confident that the suppliers are taking it very seriously. I'm confident that my team are all over it and tracking it very carefully. At the end of the day, you are still relying on the company to find out who is living in that property and whether they have a vulnerability. And without sort of data matching and the data that might be held by other parties such as government, that is not without its risks. And so one of the things I think that we do think is important is that if we're going to do this, if we're going to target quite rightly those households that are vulnerable, we do need a bit of help with matching with government so that we can say to suppliers, look, these are the properties where you need to take particular care or take particular type of action.
Two very quick questions. One, what are the numbers? So how many involuntary installations occurred in 2022, 2023, 2024?
So there were hardly any in 2023. So that was the sort of moratorium period.
Versus
the restart. Currently, we've done. There've been about just coming up to 12,000, and that includes remote switches. So those people, where it's on, I mean, the same processes apply to both. By the way, if you're on a smart meter and you're remotely switched, they still have to go through the same processes. So there's about 12,000 of those, and there's about just under 4,000 so far under warrant. Now that compares with the year before the moratorium, when there was around 400,000 across the market. So there's obviously a huge reduction in the amount of that activity. And I think what I would say on that is that that's quite right, that the market's taking a very cautious approach and taking care on it. But obviously, when we talked earlier about debt and the rise of debt in the system, we do need to move to a process. We've got fair and appropriate ways of recovering debt, and the suppliers have got the tools to do that.
Can I just expand on the point that Tim made? So the other thing we would like to work with government on, and the other thing we would like from them, and the other gap, coming back to a previous question, is around data matching. So look, there are huge amounts of data you need to target support of vulnerable customers or to identify different vulnerabilities. Now, right now, we have a system where you can tell your supplier or your network company you have a vulnerability, and that is logged and recorded. But obviously, that is inefficient, and many of the vulnerable groups that we're concerned about are not likely to do that. So we think if we had a much better access and much better sharing of data between government departments and the sector, not just the energy sector, by the way, we would have much better response.
I guess on that point, is the department, ESNES, taking it seriously?
Yes.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Is wider government taking it seriously?
I would say the department's definitely taking it seriously. I think we've got a job to do to convince the rest of government.
I think we'll follow up with you in writing on this point and one or two of the other things in those exchanges. Actually, I think it's a very important avenue to pursue. Now, Vera Hophouse, you've got an additional question on this, and then you're moving on to a different topic.
Yeah, thank you. I take a great interest in this because I was actually putting down a private member's bill asking for a moratorium while we were still in the winter, and then finally the moratorium happened when we were in the summer, and it wasn't so urgent anymore. I mean, I'm still pleased there was a moratorium. But my question is really about these vulnerable customers, because I still get constituents who seem to be getting an installation that they didn't want. And that is, how do then, when it is already in place, how the enforcement or the taking away of an installation that has happened without consent will actually happen. So what is the process? And it takes some vulnerable households some time before they actually find out where they can go. And often they end up with me when they are at the very end of the road and have already experienced a month of being cold, or the electricity is cut off. And that is definitely not what we want. So can you explain a little bit more what those households, what resource they have, or recourse?
Absolutely. So, look, I mean, the first thing I would say is that one of the things that we required suppliers to do was to review all their customers on prepayment meters and make sure that they were appropriate for the household concerned. I think what I would always say, if you've got cases that have come to light where you think people have prepayments where it's not safe and practical for them to have them, then please let us know and we can get those looked into. But I think, look, what we have done is we've set some very clear rules for suppliers about how they need to protect vulnerable consumers. For example, I mentioned earlier that we've required them to provide sort of credits for people. I mean, I think if you've got customers that you think actually this is just not the right method of payment for them because of a particular vulnerability, and I talked about some of the things we talked about earlier, then absolutely they should be contacting their supplier.
I know, but it takes some time before they come forward, and in the meantime they have sat for weeks being cold, and that is my concern about it. So a more proactive approach is probably also necessary, that people know exactly where they can go to, and if something is being installed, there's a telephone number or a helpline or something where people can go to.
Certainly on current installation, people are getting installed now against their permission, and then that we are monitoring that very, very carefully, so please do refer anything that you think that's happening in that space.
Moving on to the ban on acquisition-only tariffs, is there a risk that continuing the ban on acquisition-only tariffs into 2026 will prevent consumers from significantly benefiting from competition in the market, which may otherwise look quite different from how it does now? So it's basically the other side, where we actually have got quite savvy customers who could actually benefit from not having a ban.
Absolutely. So just stepping back, the reason initially that we introduced a ban on acquisition tariffs was it was one of a series of measures that we introduced to stabilise the market during the crisis. And I think as we've come out of that crisis, we've looked to release a lot of those measures as we've taken steps through our financial resilience regime, for example, to ensure that we've got a much more stable market. So I think the original case for the ban on acquisition tariff, I think we would all accept, is probably weaker than it was. I don't think you necessarily need it to stabilise the market. I think the thing about a ban on acquisition tariff that we paused on, and we did consult on this, and it's a very finely balanced decision. One of the things we hear very much from consumers that they don't like is that someone else, if they stick with their current supplier and somebody else is new to that supplier, gets a better offer than the one that we get. This is a market that's, frankly, had challenges with trust over the last few years. I think it's coming out of that. If you look at the last 12 months, we've seen customer satisfaction in this market going up around 10%. We've seen complaints going down by 10%. But it is rebuilding trust in the market. And I think having the ban on acquisition tariffs, I think it does play a role in helping to build that trust. Now, we extended it for another year. The reason we put that we are only doing it on a year basis, I think we need to look at pricing in the round. We talked earlier about the price cap. We've got a price cap that protects loyal customers. We've also got a ban on acquisition tariffs. I think we need to think of what sort of pricing regime do we want to hold that provides sufficient incentives for people to switch and to move around and get better deals, but also protects customers and overall protects the prices they pay. So I think it is a finely balanced decision. We are monitoring. We are seeing switching in the market. We are seeing it increase. It's actually trebled over the last few months, but it's from quite a low base after the crisis when people sort of settled on the cap. So we are monitoring it carefully. We've put it in place for another year, and I think we need to look at that, as I say, pricing regulation in the round.
I think just two things I'd add. First is when you look back at some of the causes of the sort of retail crisis I described in 2021, one of them was the fact that lots of companies were pricing, while taking a great deal of risk and usually at under cost, which is why we ended up in the situation we ended up in. And part of that was acquisition tariffs from incumbents and new entrants trying to compete with those acquisition tariffs. Second thing I'd add is just the challenge we got from our board when we were discussing this, which is, if a company's issuing a tariff, why would you exclude customers who are already there? So there's a kind of principled argument that says, if there's a price out there, shouldn't people who are within that company get access to it? And so there's a principled as well as a kind of technical reason why we might keep it.
Okay, so there is a balance, but can Ofgem even secure an optimal outcome for all customers? Is that ever possible? Is there a long plan? Is there a long-term solution?
Well, I think you need to protect customers who we know in this market. And I was discussing getting more people engaged, and back to Polly's comment, getting everyone switching in 2008, 2009 when we were in the department, and we were still having the same conversation in the late 20-teens. I think we have to accept, certainly for some time, there will be customers that don't engage in the market, and pricing regulation is really there to deal with that. I think our job is to make sure that alongside that you have a dynamic enough market that people can get better deals today. But more importantly, as we get to net zero, people have big incentives to move on time flexible tariffs. And the way I think we would say we see it broadly is you might be dealing with two very different groups and making sure you've got regulation for both.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Mike Reader, please.
Thank you. We're going to talk about failing energy firms and the cost to consumers. A very quick question to begin with. Are you satisfied that all suppliers in the retail market are operating on a sustainable footing?
So, as you allude to, we've introduced a new regime, a financial resilience regime, which puts requirements on suppliers to ensure that they are holding sufficient capital for shocks. So that regime is coming in. It comes in full from March this year. So we are confident, in answer to your question, that all suppliers are working towards those rules. I'll say about 2/3 of them are already compliant, and we expect the others to be compliant or to have a plan to be so over the next sort of 12 months.
What does being compliant mean, sorry?
So what this means specifically for the capital adequacy rules is that they are holding sufficient money to allow for a shock, and that can come in different forms. It could be a sort of a parental guarantee, or it could be sort of cash in the bank.
And the firms that aren't yet compliant, are they sort of random firms, or is a particular kind of type of firm that is struggling to be compliant?
We could get very technical on all of this. I mean, I think that there are certain things that certain companies are needing to do that we need to move around. I think as a whole in this market, we are much more confident that we have a much more stable market now, that we're protecting consumers' money, and that in any market, suppliers from time to time will exit the market, and that's the sign of a well-functioning market. We need to make sure that if that happens, it happens in an orderly fashion, and that we're protecting consumers. I think the regime we've got in place now does that.
I'll just say just two things. Again, if you look at the drivers of this, there were two aspects. The first set of companies that failed were issuing tariffs without any hedging or protection. So it just meant that I was offering you £1,000 a year tariff, which was cheap at the time. But when the market hit a price that was $1,200, I simply couldn't pay my bills to give you your energy anymore. And in a sense, one of the things our regime has done, which I think is broadly across the market, is it's made sure that everyone is hedging, and hedging properly, particularly against the price cap. The other thing that Tim is referring to then is we think any company cannot guarantee it's not going to have risk. So if you have a cold day and high prices, that costs the retailer a lot to buy the energy on that day, and that needs to be somehow funded and managed. So therefore, we're saying to companies, you need to hold enough cash that can get you through those times when you might face variances that you'd normally see in the market. And look, it is very much like the story with banks. We can't say the sector is perfect right now, but it's on that journey, and we're moving this bell curve up to what we think is a much better place.
If there are firms still not compliant by March, what's the steps you'll take?
So where we will need to get to by March, and where I'm confident we will get to, is that each supplier needs to have a capitalisation plan agreed with us that brings them into compliance. And I think we will get to that point. If not, we have measures that we can take against those companies. So we do have powers.
And what further measures could you take to put in place to reduce the risk of firms going bust and that cost being placed at the feet of consumers?
So I think the regime that we've introduced is a comprehensive one. We went through a lot of consultation on it. We were challenged on it and appealed on it, and that was upheld. There are people out there who think it's far too onerous on the suppliers, and there's people who think that it doesn't go far enough. But I think our judgment is that we've got the right sort of balance. I think in terms of cost to consumers, there were obviously costs to consumers from the failures during the gas crisis. They've largely now come out of the system, so it's less than £1 a year per customer now for those costs. And I think the regime that we have now will ensure that we will see entry and exit into this market, as you would expect, but in a way that controls and restricts those costs to consumers.
So on a very practical level, we're at a point, as Tim says, where we expect every company to have a capitalisation plan. If we're not satisfied with the plan, or indeed if the plan is not adhered to, then there's a series of interventions we can make. For example, we can stop that company taking on any customers. So we say, look, we can't stop the risk that's there, but we can stop that risk growing. We can also take more traditional enforcement action, and we can issue fines, etc., if we need to. So this is very much going to be something where we are both working with the companies to make sure that they are sufficiently capitalised, but we have a set of regulatory tools to make them move if they need to.
You recognise that the costs have largely come down, but there was a big spike in standing charges, particularly through the supplier of last resort scheme. What steps have you taken to try and recoup some of the cost from the shareholders and owners of those companies that went bankrupt? Could you set out the legal and non-legal methods that you've used to try and recoup that money?
Sure.
So
there's two aspects to this. There's one we can tackle, and there's one that when I think about new powers, I would like Ofgem to be able to tackle in the future. So what we can tackle is we can tackle areas where, for example, renewables obligation payments weren't made and there were in effect debts to government, and we've been pursuing that through the courts, and we've been fairly successful. But I think one of the massive frustrations for me during the crisis was seeing companies go bust where shareholders then walked away with valuable energy hedges that grew in value over time as the crisis went on. Now, I think that points to a fundamental problem that we have in terms of the extent of our powers. In my view, if a set of shareholders or indeed executives have created that level of consumer harm or cost, that should be a call on the company in administration. And quite frankly, before anybody else gets paid anything, customers need to be paid back. We can't fully control that, and I think we need the powers to do so.
Sorry, Mike. How were they able to separate these assets from the assets of the company?
So when they go into supplier of last resort, the customers get moved away and the company gets wound up. And at that point in time, the company's negative value. But then if the market spikes after that point and suddenly those hedges become incredibly valuable, then shareholders were able to realise some of that value.
Don't go to the administrator.
No, and that they don't go from the administrator back to customers, and we would like a way to be able to recover that.
Right. Do we know
Yes,
what was the quantum of the? Do you think that you talked about the spike in value afterwards for some of these companies? Do we know what the quantum?
So it was material. I mean, it was hundreds of millions of pounds in the end. Now to different companies, and we can send you the detailed figures, but it's something that I think we need to fix.
This sits outside company law and insolvency law.
It does, and in fact, there's an interaction with insolvency law that makes this very complicated. But I think the general point I would make is we are in a complex market already. We're in a complex market with complex corporate structures, just like other regulated industries. And we are seeing a huge change coming in the next few years. Now, no one, including us, can guarantee there won't be issues that customers need to deal with. I think the regulator should have the power to be able to identify where there's been significant customer harm and ask for compensation when that happens.
Do you have any evidence that any of this was blatant or premeditated or in some way planned?
So in the instances where we saw companies fail and we saw shareholders be able to make the sort of money they made, I have no direct evidence that this was planned. I mean, the whole crisis was a situation that I don't think people anticipated. But do I think some shareholders took advantage of it? Yes, I do.
Yeah. Great. I think another topic to pursue further. Thank you very much. Luke Murphy, you're next.
Thanks. So we wanted to move on to sort of smart meters and radio teleswitch meters. You mentioned earlier in your evidence that you saw there being kind of two groups in the market, I think, where you were talking under the price cap. I think you were saying maybe a group that are more, correct me if I'm wrong, were you suggesting there's a group that are likely to kind of respond more flexibly and move around, and those that be more static? I just wanted to clarify on that because it's relevant to this question, which is, I know it's being a bit crude, but what proportion do you imagine in the static group versus those that are going to be kind of super kind of fleet of foot and flexible? And
let's look at history, and when there was the most switching in the market, you had about 60% coverage of the price cap, and about 40% of the market there were people who were engaging in the market. When you think about time of use tariffs, they're quite niche customers right now, but I think over time we expect that to grow and grow substantially. So I would like a market where everyone is able to engage in some of the advantages we're going to see through more flexible use of demand. I mean, it's going to take smart meters and technical interventions. It's going to take a big shift in the way we see and we use our energy. So my point is, for the time until we get there, we need some form of pricing regulation.
And how fundamental is the rollout of smart meters to that market that we want to deliver, and how do you think it's going?
It's absolutely critical. We talked earlier about customers being able to engage, bringing customers along in the journey. Smart metering is a gateway into sort of visibility and understanding of your energy use. We not only that, but just much improved customer service from having a smart meter. We reckon, I've spent time in sort of supplier call centres listening to customer calls, and you see the difference of engagement that a call handler can have with a smart metered customer versus not. They can see their usage, they can put credits on the meter remotely, for example. There's so much more support that a supplier can offer in the moment. So there are a number of benefits, and it's absolutely critical because it's critical to that trust piece and it's critical to that engagement piece. In terms of how it's going, so we now have government's programme, smart meter rollout programme, now has reached about 65% market penetration among domestic households for smart meters and just under 60% for businesses. And when you look at that compared to other jurisdictions that have quite a similar approach to their rollout, it compares quite favourably. But there are challenges. We see a lot of coverage, particularly at the moment, around smart meters that are not operating as they should be. 90% are, but 10% are not. And the challenge with that is it immediately dampens the experience. You're not getting the benefits that you signed up for, and it leads to sort of a poor reputation around smart metering. So this is why this is something that's really, really important to us, and 10% not working properly is too many. Our role in the smart meter programme is largely around compliance and enforcement of supplier obligations against their installation targets and meters operating as they should. And last year we fined suppliers around £10 million for failing to meet installation targets. This year we are taking the largest ever compliance action that we have against the 6 largest suppliers, with a focus both on meeting their installation targets but getting those meters operating as they should. I'm heartened to see that since we started that, we've seen 300,000 of those roughly 3 million non-operating meters come back online, but there's a lot more work to do. And so our focus at the moment is understanding the challenges, but making sure that our expectations to suppliers are absolutely clear, that they have remedial plans to get back on track and get these meters operating as they should and get meters on walls. And we won't hesitate to take further action if we need to.
Regional discrepancies, do you think, in the rollout of smart meters? It's benefiting, it's accelerating, and what are they, and why do you think that is?
So the approach to the rollout is absolutely anybody that wants a smart meter should absolutely have access to one, and that is absolutely critical for us, and that is our expectation of suppliers. We focus a lot on ensuring that they have adequate engineering capacity.
But just on that point, is there a difference, a notable difference in regional coverage?
We do see a difference, although it can be quite variable. So we do see lower penetration rates, for example, in some more remote and rural regions, but equally we see some challenges in heavy density urban areas too, where
HMOs.
Yeah, exactly. So there are, it's not necessarily solely regional, but different challenges in reaching different households and businesses.
Can I just ask a question about non-acceptance? So if a customer says, I don't want one, and I never want one, what's the answer?
As things stand, it is not a requirement to have a smart meter, and we see around 15% of households outright refuse. But what we also see is just a fair amount of agnostics. You need persuading, open to getting a smart meter potentially, but want to see the benefits in it for them. There are some differences. You mentioned RTS earlier, for example. Now, this is a programme where the meters will not continue working as expected after June this year. And in that case, while a smart meter is not mandatory as the solution, those customers do need to get their meters upgraded, and in most cases a smart meter is the best answer for them. But at the moment, if a customer refuses, that is their right to do so.
What needs to happen? What needs to change so that people see the benefits, that agnostic? I take your point about those people who are going to say no, but those agnostics, what can be done to make it really attractive so they want a smart meter?
I think it's an empowerment point, and recognising that understanding their energy use. We see, for example, that many households, just from having a smart meter and having the in-home display or an app or whatever it is that they choose to sort of look at their energy use, can actually just reduce how much energy they're using in the first place, and we'll still see bill savings. I think we see increasingly that customers switch not just for bill savings but for customer service, and I think where you can get better customer service with a smart meter, that is an enticing proposition. I think particularly as we move into a world and into a market where customers will be more flexible or need to be more flexible and engaged and potentially can get real benefits from doing so, it is that opportunity, and seeing more innovative products come into the market that offer customers savings and benefits from them contributing and them participating in their energy use is really key to making sure that there's adoption.
Sorry to jump in, Chair. You talked about the importance of communication, and I think it's a reflection we would all make that the communication around smart meters has not been ideal. I mean, just on a basic level, it means you don't have to put in your meter readings. You're no longer running on an analogue system. I mean, I can't express strongly enough the benefits of smart prepayment meters over analogue meters. If you run out, you don't have to go down the street to a shop that may or may not be open to top up. So there are real material benefits today, as well as all the exciting things that people like us get enthusiastic around sort of flexible markets, and we need to do a better job of communicating those to customers.
So you think a lot of it is people don't realise how good this is?
I think part of it is that. I think it does not help having some of the technical problems we've had with the meters that are there, but I think, particularly for prepayment meter customers, the benefits are material, and we need to make that clear.
Just very quickly going back to the regional point, is the way in which they communicate, does that impact it? Because some rely on a cellular network, some rely on radio. I mean, is that impacting the regional differential?
You're right that there are two different technologies. So there's a smart metering communications network across GB, and in the north, so Northern England and Scotland, it operates on a radio signal, and in the south and Wales, it is a cellular network. We are exploring the impact this is potentially having on those non-operating meters, but it is only one of the reasons that we see that, and it's not necessarily the largest driver of non-operating smart meters.
And just final question for me on this is the industry have said to me that they lack certainty beyond the end of this year. They've also said that they find some of the rigid targets kind of not helpful in the sense of, I mean, I appreciate what you said about, and I'm not necessarily saying I agree with them, but I wanted to put the case where they think that, there's actually there's a bit of a flow, and actually a bit more, they want the end result, but they want more flexibility, or some of them do want more flexibility rather than the kind of static targets. I'm just interested on those 2 points. Is that something you're open to? And what do you think about the certainty around the framework post the end of this year?
So you are right that the smart meter rollout framework, as currently designed by the department, comes to an end at the end of 2025, and the department are thinking very carefully about what the future of that looks like, and we are supporting them in that. I think it's absolutely right to sort of recognise the point that we're at. We are at 65% among domestic households, but we have perhaps reached some of the early adopters. We are going to have new challenges in getting to harder to reach communities and households. We are seeing technology upgrades that are needed in the coming years as well. So it is a good time to be thinking about what the future of that rollout framework looks like. On the targets, again, this would be for the department to set. I think we recognise that there are different ways of thinking about this. There are different benefits to different types of customers, and we might want to think about prioritising some over others, but we're certainly welcome the conversation with suppliers around the best way. But they should be under no doubt that it's a benefit to them and their customers to get as many smart meters on walls as possible.
I think the only thing I would add is that there should be a debate about the incentives around this. So already there are tariffs in the market that are attached to a smart meter, for example, and so I think it's quite good we're having a break point to have a look at the regime and see how we deal with the remaining 35%.
And my final question would just kind of take us back to where we started, was around kind of consumers moving around and changing behaviour. I just wonder about how much you think actually we might be expecting too much of consumers in the sense of, given how long it's taken to get to a position where lots of people want to switch. I'm being slightly crude, but someone isn't going to want to get up at 4 a.m. to turn their washing machine on to benefit from the best. So the reason I ask that is, are you looking into and working with the department on how AI and technology can help assist that? Because there are companies out there looking at how AI could help a household identify when it would be best, what's the best tariff for them based on their energy usage, but also looking at, which just takes the burden away from consumers, which I think is actually quite a big expectation, and most people don't have time to do a lot of that stuff.
I'll kick off and then perhaps I mean, I think, look, I'm a simple energy customer myself. I'm not a super sophisticated customer, and my principle for myself and for others is, that if this is going to take a huge amount of kind of intellectual and analytical engagement, we're probably not going to be successful. So the more this can be automated, the more you get the simplicity of the service, the more successful the industry will be and we will be. Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. Look, the history of this market suggests that you shouldn't have to expect consumers to make really complicated decisions and make it very difficult for them. I mean, the history of this market has been that we've tried to rely on that in the past. It hasn't happened. I think there is a role for things like defaults. If you look at what we're doing now on electric vehicles, for example, you've got defaults to ensure that they're charging up at the cheapest times of the day, and people haven't actually got to make active decisions. And I think there's definitely a role for looking about that in the future.
The challenge comes when you have 3 apps you have to have aligned in order to do these things.
Yeah, can I just ask? Can I
just
very quickly, because I think we actually need a separate session on smart metering, but that's because we're getting into the nitty-gritty of this. But coming back to vulnerable customers, all of this is actually assuming that all people are digitally included and are digitally literate. And I think we are coming to the point, even us as possibly more engaged and digitally literate, there are lots of people out there who who are not, and I think we really need to consider those. And also when, for example, a smart meter is being installed, that you actually get a session on how to work it actually. Yes. And that is not happening, and those are massive issues that we have to consider during the rollout of smart metering. Have you got any just reflection on that very quickly?
I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, we want to make sure that suppliers have got to be engaging with their customers through a number of different formats. I mean, I think the key thing is that there is an element of learning how to use it, but actually what a smart meter can do is take away so much of the burden of thinking about energy use. It can help a supplier engage with you without you really having to do very much, because they can see your usage, because perhaps they can put credits on the meter, things like that.
Can we just pick up on that point though? For prepayment meter customers, this is much better. So if you have an analogue meter with an old-fashioned key that I used to have 20 years ago when I lived in my first flat in London, the company can't see what you're doing. So you go off supply. There's one of those customers you mentioned who ends up being self-disconnected. The company hasn't got visibility and can't really do anything to address that. And if they want to help you top up, you're going to have to go down the street, as I mentioned, to be able to do so. If you have a smart meter, even if you are digitally excluded, company knows when you're going off supply, and if you want to phone up and ask for additional credit or additional support, they can do that in an automatic way. That's a significant benefit for those customers.
Thanks very much. Polly Billington.
Yeah, I just have one final one. You said that there was 65% penetration at the moment, and then 15% of people were refusers. Are the 15% included in the 65, in that you basically say, yes, they're done, because we asked them and they said no? Or are they...
No, sorry, 65
are actually done.
Yeah.
Then there's 15% that said no thanks. So you're actually at 80%.
I suppose if you...
20% agnostic.
To understand whether the no's were included or not.
Are you calling 20% agnostic?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, interesting. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting part of the session. Chris Chope is now going to ask you about park homes and some related points, I think.
Thank you. I'm sorry I had to absent myself, but I'm on the procedure committee as well, and we had the speaker coming to give evidence. But I'm delighted to be able to get onto this issue, which is around non-domestic users and the domestic users of non-domestic contracts. And I'm very grateful to Tim Jarvis for having responded to some constituency correspondence, which I sent to him on behalf of residents at Oak Tree Park, which is a park home residential area, a large site in my constituency. And one of the constituents there had said that he understood the price cap was in round figures about 24 pence, and he's being charged 31 pence, and what can be done about it. And I've said earlier to the chairman that I got this very good response, and I'm going to circulate that to the committee, so we don't have to repeat what's contained in that response. But essentially, what it says is, not me, Gov, that there's a limit to what you are able to do as Ofgem. You refer to the maximum resale price rules, but then you say that the Ofgem does not enforce the rules of the maximum resale price direction. Essentially, this is a civil issue, and if you are a park home resident, you're going to have to ultimately take it to the tribunal if you can't get agreement from the site owner. This very day, I had a conversation with somebody who phoned up from a caravan site. He's been resident in a residential caravan, not a park home, but for 25 years, and he said he's paying about £400 a month as a site fee, but he's paying about £100 a week electricity. Now, this gives the impression that there's a bit of a rip-off, and I wondered why Ofgem doesn't enforce the rules of the maximum resale price direction. Is that because it chooses not to, or it doesn't have the power so to do?
Yeah, so let me pick that up and look. Absolutely. Sorry, it did come across as a not us government. I think there are things we can do. There are things we've done. And I think there are challenges, and perhaps I'll talk through some of that. So in answer to your specific question, so we have set rules to ensure that anybody reselling energy to an end user cannot effectively make a profit out of that. The challenge we've got, as you rightly point out, is that they are for a customer at the moment to exercise those rules, they have to go through the courts, and that's because we don't have the power to take up cases on behalf of individual customers and enforce those sort of rules. And there's a question about whether that's the right thing to do. Now, what would happen in other parts of the market, for example, is you'd have access to some sort of alternative dispute resolution service. So we think that it would really help to enforce those rules if people like your constituent had access to that. So instead of having to go to court, they could go to some ombudsman or an enforcement, an alternative dispute resolution service. We have made that case very strongly to government, and I think we will continue to push on that, because I think that is an important way for people to be able to exercise the rules that we put in place. But you are right. At the moment, we don't have the powers to investigate individual cases.
Last year, my understanding is the previous government issued a consultation around this whole area. Where has that got to? What are you expecting to happen as a result of that, or is that dead in the water?
Well, I think we're talking to the government about what its plans are, and we're waiting to see what decisions might come out of this. I mean, I think there are a couple of areas that certainly bear looking at. The first is this one about alternative dispute resolution and whether you could put something in place. We've highlighted the fact, for example, I think there's legislation going through Parliament on private renters at the moment that introduces a dispute resolution service. Could you expand that and incorporate these sort of cases into that, for example, would be one thing that we think could be worth doing. I think the other thing that we're focused on and are talking to government about, and this is coming up in our future regulation of heat networks, and this may well come up in later questioning, but where somebody's energy costs are tied up with their contractual relationship for their housing, which is the example we've got here, and we also get it in heat networks, then at the moment we can't really regulate that. We can't go beyond the contract that people have got. If they've got a contract to pay their energy through their rent, then that obviously takes us out of the equation. So I think that there is something there about these sort of cases to ensure that not just have we got the rules in place, but that people are able to enforce against them. The other thing that we have done, which I also referred to in the letter, is that there were industry codes and rules which made it difficult for people to move from taking their energy supply through their landlord and getting a contract direct with a supplier. So we have very recently changed those rules to allow people so that they can have access to a domestic supplier. You still come up against this slight challenge that if it's part of your contractual arrangement with your rent. So I think that's one of the things that we are talking to the housing department about at the moment, about how we can make sure that we can get the right protections for people.
Is there anything else you think you could do to bring to the attention of these residents their right to be informed about how much their landlord, for want of a better expression, is paying?
Absolutely.
So that they can then calculate whether or not they are being ripped off. At the moment, most people seem to be rather ignorant about those rights.
Absolutely, and there are requirements on landlords to provide that information to their tenants to tell them that. But I think absolutely, we're always looking at what we can do more to highlight what people's rights are and what they can ask for and what information they can get. And I think we're constantly looking at.
Yeah, I mean, two things I'd say. Come back to this point about our communications role. We have something called the Energy Aware campaign, and I think we should take away making this part of it, so making people aware of their rights in general, including in this issue. But look, it does relate to the kind of regulator you might want in the future. So the simple answer, Sir Christopher, is we don't license landlords, so we haven't got a license through which we can set rules and fine like we can retailers, networks and others. Now, if you imagine customers in 2035 or 2030 are going to be getting their energy from solar panels that have been installed, aggregators that may be operating them, battery installers, people who use their car battery. And my concern is actually we don't have the suite of powers or the ability to manage our regulatory boundary to be able to deal with that. So I think when we talk about the Ofgem review, start with the customer, start where their energy is coming from, and give the regulator the power to be able to intervene to protect customer whichever way they get their energy. And we are looking at models in financial services, for example, or indeed in Ofcom, where things are defined differently that just allows the regulator to be a bit more adaptable to a fast-changing market.
Can I just go back to the more general issue of non-domestic users, and we touched on the costs at the very beginning of this evidence session. What more do you think you can do to reduce energy costs for non-domestic business users so that they are more internationally competitive? Because our costs are so high.
Tim, I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, shall I sort of kick off on that? I mean, look, I think I'll sort of start at the macro level and work down, if you like. I mean, there's sort of three things, I think, which determine our prices for non-domestic consumers and affect how they compare with internationally. The first of those is our reliance on gas, and we've talked about that at length, and that's a sort of broader issue where we're looking at that through Clean Power 20.
Sorry, but isn't that a bit of a red herring? Because actually gas prices are international. If they're international, why is it that our energy prices are higher than anybody else's?
It's the use of gas to generate our electricity is the issue there, and that's the thing that's moving through the government. The second thing that drives our costs is policy costs and where they fall in the market, which is obviously something that we've also talked about and I know government is thinking about. I think the thing that's in our control, and Akshay may want to come on this, is the network costs and how they are shared. Now, what we can do is sort of move those costs between different types of consumers, so we can move them from non-domestic businesses to domestic consumers. We've made decisions on that in the past, and I think that's something that we sort of keep under review. And I think when you get into the micro level, what can we do? Well, we did do a big review of energy costs in the non-domestic sector. I think one of the areas where we found, certainly I think definitely a case for intervention was around the use of brokers and these energy brokers and third-party intermediaries. There's some good ones in that market. I think there's lots in those market where people are getting quite a poor deal. We've introduced rules to make sure that they are transparent, but the government is consulting on the regulation of those intermediaries, and that's potentially a future role for us in taking that on.
Just one thing to add, I mean, as I mentioned before, there is a government scheme that is quite narrowly focused now on energy intensive users in internationally competitive markets that does offer discounts to some of these charges that Tim has laid out. I think it's worth exploring that, whether we've got the scope of that right and how that should be applied in a world of AI and data centres where clearly a lot of energy hungry investors are going to be looking for sites in countries like Britain.
Thank you very much indeed. A change of tack. The former Secretary of State changed her mind about sustainability of DRACs. Have you?
Well, I think you need to understand our role. So we don't make decisions such as whether or not DRACs is in policy terms a good thing. That is for the department, and it's for the department to set the rules. Our job is to make sure that DRACs is complying with the rules that are there. Now, you know the investigation that we had and what we found, to be clear, was not that DRACs had breached the broad rules that set the financial sort of subsidies within the scheme, but they had misreported what was there, and that's why they were fined £25 million.
Okay. There have been quite a lot of additional media reporting since your previous investigations. Yes. And Financial Times and Private Eye raised concerns. Are you going to be investigating further?
So there is nothing that has come to light that was not within the scope of the investigation that we carried out. One of the actions that we asked for from DRACs as part of the conclusion of that investigation is they have to now audit all of their supply chain. Now, if there is any additional evidence that comes to light, if there's anything that we think reopens the conclusion that we came to, then yes, of course, we'd investigate again, but we're not at that point now.
Your request for audit was 5 months ago, I think I've got that right. Who is undertaking the audit? When is it going to be published, and when will you be able to share an update on the audit with this committee?
So I'll need to come back on who is doing it. It will take time. So it's still being, this is a very, very detailed scope of a very detailed assessment of supply chains to many different countries. So it's going to take time to go through. So, I mean, I'd expect it, but it's going to take many months before we come to a conclusion. But yes, that will be published.
Thank you. KPMG reportedly carried out a review of DRACs operations and internal review. There have been apparently a very significant number of whistleblowers as well. This was all in a House of Lords debates on the 11th of November. Have you followed up on any of the analysis and comments made in that debate with Drax?
So we have had, within the evidence that we saw, that includes the KPMG report that is mentioned, and we have been in touch with a number of whistleblowers as part of that investigation. As I say, if we have anything new that is highlighted that we think reopens the conclusions of the investigation, then we would reopen. But we will continue to actively monitor what's going on.
So far, in those discussions with whistleblowers, there's been nothing new?
Not that reopens the conclusions that we had.
Okay, thank you. Murphy.
Very quick question on the auditor. Did you have to agree who the auditor was, or was that fully up to Drax to decide?
That's a combined decision of both scoping and the auditor and how that audit's carried out.
And there were emails referred to in the Financial Times article on the 15th of October. Are you able to share those with the committee?
So I would need to go back and just ask what the legal position is on that. But all of the conclusions of the review that we carried out, which was over 3,000 documents, led to the conclusion that we came to. And to be clear, we did see the fact that Drax had reported wrongly where its feedstock was coming from, but not of a scale that would breach its obligations under the renewables obligation. And that is partly because, in a sense, the renewable obligation has two parts. So 70% of it is under very strict sustainability criteria, and 30% of it are under more loose criteria. So you have to go quite far before you start breaching the financial part of the renewables obligation, and therefore, you get to begin to ask questions such as whether companies should return subsidies.
Barry Gardner wrote to you on the 15th of January.
Yes.
When are you going to be able to reply to him?
Well, I mean, in the coming weeks. Not weeks.
Good. I'm sure he will discuss his your response with us at that stage. I'm sure we will have further exchanges in writing on this topic. Thank you very much indeed. Polly Billington.
Thank you very much. This is about hydrogen heating and consumer agency. What is your assessment of hydrogen heating's trials that have taken place so far?
Akshay, do you want to come back on that?
I think the clear indication from the hydrogen heating trials experience is that consumers resist change, and I think that's the challenge. In the trials, there's only one trial left now, I think, in terms of the H100 project that is being done by SGN. We're certainly going to continue to produce the evidence from that trial to make sure that hydrogen is safe and it can be transported safely, and that the consumer experience in the household in terms of using hydrogen boilers is a good one. But the main thing that the trials are not able to test at the moment is how do you deal with the issue of change. So if somebody has a existing system and you want to move them to a new heating system, there is that sort of natural reluctance. And I think, as the Secretary of State indicated in his evidence to you last week, I think at the moment it isn't particularly attractive because you have to spend a lot of money to change your heating systems, even though there's a government grant in terms of moving to heat pumps, for instance. And I think that's where we have to focus our efforts. We have to make it both better as a heating service as well as cheaper as a heating service. Now, on hydrogen in particular, I think we've had some indications. We've had a National Infrastructure Commission report which indicated that they felt that hydrogen is probably not going to be the dominant fuel for heating. Our assessment at the moment is that we think that for the majority of households across the country, as long as we can address the issues I raised in terms of what is causing the resistance right now, electricity should be a really good solution in the long term for heating. But there will be probably pockets where it is difficult to put heat pumps and to electrify, and that's where we need some alternatives, and that's why we're carrying on with the H100 trial with SGN, and we are also doing our work to introduce regulation into heat networks.
So, I've got a drafted question here, but I'm going to ask you from the basis of what you've said to me. You still think there needs to be a mix of solutions to heating, depending on where people live. That still creates quite a lot of uncertainty at the moment. Or the situation we're in creates quite a lot of uncertainty. What do you think Ofgem can do to reduce that uncertainty for the consumer?
So I think there's a range of things that we can do and are doing. I think the first and most important thing is to produce the evidence base on the alternatives. At the moment, heat pumps is a perfectly viable technology. I think we understand what is causing the resistance to the take-up of heat pumps. There's essentially an economic issue there that has to be addressed. And that's a combination of the support that is provided to consumers as well as the industry trying to bring those costs down over time. We can certainly play our part in terms of looking at the cost of electricity versus the cost of gas. I think we've communicated to government that we are very supportive of the rebalancing, and as Jonathan said, and as the Secretary of State said to you last week, the government is actively considering this. It is a complicated issue, but they are considering this. Thirdly, we want to do our level best to ensure that in terms of alternatives, heat networks and hydrogen for heating, that we are able to produce the evidence that can help the government to make informed decisions on the rollout of those alternatives.
They've been delaying this decision. Are they really delaying this decision because you haven't given them enough evidence?
So look, I mean, this is a policy decision for government, and so we, like everybody, are waiting for them to be able to set that direction. So that's what will provide clarity. Just one thing I want to add is we do run the boiler upgrade scheme, and that is what is catalysing the heat pump market. And if I look back at history, it was the renewables obligation and FITs that started the whole renewables revolution we're seeing. I'm hoping that by catalysing this market, we'll see heat pumps in the same place. But ultimately, there are limits to what we can do because ultimately we need direction from government.
And also, like, a lot of people are sort of saying we don't want to decommission the gas network because we want to keep consumer agency over home heating and continue to have that as an option. So what level of hydrogen rollout in home heating will be needed to avoid that decommissioning of the gas network?
I think we'll need to come back to you on that, because at the moment we don't have very good scenarios for how much of different parts of the country will be suitable for hydrogen for home heating. That's why that government decision is so important. Our best scenario at the moment is that for the next 10 years we're unlikely to see a big change in the gas networks, and therefore we think it is probably premature to talk about the decommissioning of the gas networks. In the price review that is coming up, what we've indicated is we are going to start to increase the rate at which we return the capital that is invested in those gas networks, so that we have a fairness in terms of how much gas consumers pay for the gas network over time. If you think
that's one of the problems, isn't it?
That's one of the issues. So as over time, as consumers switch from gas to heat pumps, you have essentially a gas network which has a fixed cost that is going to be paid for by a reducing population of consumers, which will be basically paying higher and higher gas charges. And we want to try as far as we can to try and equalize those. But again, back to your question about what we can do to point out potential policy gaps to the government, we've been in dialogue with the government to say, look, this is a system-wide issue, and it would be really good to look at whether that cost of maintaining the gas networks to continue to provide a safe and reliable service to the people that are connected on the gas networks, many of which may not have the means to switch very easily to heat pumps, that can be spread more fairly across the population of bill payers across the country. We're doing what we can within our powers, but there are certainly things that the government could do to help us.
I'd say this is an active conversation with gas networks, so they're aware of all scenarios for their future, and we need to bring them into this conversation as well.
I'm also struck, Chair, by you saying, Akshay, that it's it'll be 10 years and it's too early to say. In energy terms, 10 years is tomorrow. So if we're saying it's too early to start talking about decommissioning the gas network, are we really suggesting that the gas network is going to be here not just for 10 years, but for 20, 25?
I mean, I think you're highlighting exactly the reason why it would be helpful to have a policy decision on heat
Polite, Akshay. Can we note
sooner
that?
rather than later. We've been quite vocal about the fact that the earlier the government, it's a very difficult decision to make. I have a lot of sympathy for the government. They have to think through it very carefully. But once you make a policy decision on electricity versus other alternatives, then we can start to plan the future of the system, particularly on the gas side, much, much better. And we can start to take a look at these economic issues in terms of who pays, how much, at what time.
So with direction, this becomes a whole lot easier for us.
I want to go back to something you touched on. You seem to say that there are significant parts of the country where the gas network just is not suitable for hydrogen. Have I correctly heard you?
No, so I think the gas networks can transport the hydrogen. What I was saying was, for large parts of the country, hydrogen will be a much more expensive solution compared to heat pumps, and therefore it makes sense to electrify them for heating.
The cost of generation.
Heat pumps are much more efficient than hydrogen, essentially.
Thank you. Mike Reader.
I think you might answer my question, so I'll frame it slightly differently, but you did pick up on the point that as we have a reducing number of people using the gas network, the cost of maintaining, I know you talk about decommissioning, maintaining will sit on a fewer and fewer number of consumers. The government's drive towards heat pumps is pretty inevitable. I know you say you're waiting for a final policy decision, but all the mood music is directing us in one way. Are Ofgem now already working on how you're going to protect consumers who can't use heat pumps and will bear the cost of maintaining the gas network? Because there's no other option for them, is there?
Yes, I think we are very concerned about exactly the issue that you describe. We've indicated in the ongoing price review that we want to start accelerate. It's a very technical term, but we want to start accelerating the depreciation of the gas networks. What that means in practice is that the sum of money that has been invested in the gas networks, we want to start returning that to investors faster, so that over time consumers are paying broadly similar rates for the service that they receive from the gas network. But no matter...
That's something you're already working on. So,
yeah.
But there is a function or a team in Ofwat who are looking at this specifically now to get ahead of this, rather than waiting for the policy decision before you take action to protect consumers.
There is a team in Ofgem, and we are encouraging the government actually to think about the future of gas, as I mentioned, systematically, so that when we have a policy decision on heat, it comes alongside a plan for the transition of the gas networks.
And this is active conversation through our price controls and through the network regulation that we have.
Yeah.
Mike's already asked my question.
Murphy, even. Murphy. Claire Young.
Thank you, Chair. I think lots of the questions I had about decommissioning the gas network probably already been covered, though I don't think you actually said a point in time by which you think the policy decisions need to be made. Are you able to put a figure on it?
Point in time when
where the policy decisions need to be made about the made on addressing the share of the costs of decommissioning, all those issues around the decommissioning of the grid. Have you got a date for that?
I think the current policy date is 2026. That's when the government is currently planning to make a policy decision on heat. And I think we have a price review that is going to essentially set prices for the gas networks that go from 2026 to 2031. So this price review, we think, is fine. We can manage by just accelerating the depreciation, as I mentioned. That is a perfectly reasonable temporary measure. But the next price review, 2031 to 2036, we think it is going to be very important that we have a clear policy decision in 2026 and a plan then for the transition of the gas networks thereafter.
Do you think there is a tipping point in the decommissioning process where the remainder of the gas network, it just won't be viable, it'll have to be removed, and the last users forced onto alternative heating systems?
Yes, I think that, as you said, there's a practical issue with the gas networks. You know, if you're supplying gas through pipes into a community, you can't decommission the pipes until every user has transitioned to something else. And where you have a patchwork with hydrogen and electricity, that makes it more complicated. It's the reason why we introduced this idea of the regional system planners so that we can start to plan the gas and electricity networks together in each of the regions across the country. And then we can work out almost street by street, where you can have to continue the service and where you can start to turn the gas pipes off. But it is quite a considerable undertaking. It's not at all a trivial question when you start thinking about the decommissioning of the gas networks. And there are quite significant safety issues with maintaining the pressure through the pipes as the population of consumers change.
Do you think that will then force a point where a policy decision will have to be made that users will have to move on to alternatives?
I think
because
so.
At the
because
moment,
I think
what you're describing is you can do it partially. You can do it by looking at how much they've switched, and taking certain places off and not others.
Yeah.
But there will come a point, surely.
There is a point at which the economics starts to, it becomes self-perpetuating, if you like. So for instance, if you think about, if you don't do anything, and consumers start to switch away from gas networks to heat pumps, to electricity, and the population of consumers shrinks, then the price of staying on gas goes up and up and up and up. And that drives more and more people to switch away from gas to heat. And you get into this potential spiral. And we're very keen to avoid a kind of disorderly spiral away from gas to electricity. Much better to have an orderly transition.
Just on that, I mean, I think what we are saying, and remember, a lot of this ultimately is for government to decide, is that's why you need regional and local leadership to drive this in a coordinated way. We don't have answers to what you do when that gas network gets to a certain stage, but that's why we think, we need the policy direction from government, but this is going to need to be thought through carefully to make sure it works for all customers.
And some consumers, those last ones left on network, may well be those who, for economic reasons, are going to struggle to make the change. What do you see as your role at that stage where gas prices are increasing massively and you're getting the poorest in society having to pay those prices on an ongoing basis because they can't make the changes to their house, to their heating system?
So I think it would be a failure of the system if we ended up in that place, because we can anticipate this, and I think that's why we're so keen to work with the government to plan for that scenario and avoid a situation in which you have very vulnerable or low-income families being left to pay eye-wateringly high prices for their gas service.
And I mean, clearly the things you can do is socialise some of those costs amongst others, and also, as I say, have much greater local planning in how you go about doing it.
How confident are you that you can avoid a disorderly transition and contribute to an orderly transition?
I think if we're planning the transition properly, then I'm pretty confident that we can do it in a controlled manner. But it does require a sequence of things. It requires a policy decision on heat to be taken, a very clear one, and then to have a sense in different parts of the country what is the broad composition of electricity versus other alternatives. And then we can start to work up the plan with the gas networks. And as Jonathan said, a very important consideration here is having more than just gas consumers as an alternative to pay for the gas network that remains. I think that's the key really here to make the transition orderly.
Holly Bellington.
Thank you. I'm just trying to tease out a little bit what you said about there might be some people or some places where heat pumps might not be suitable, and therefore we might keep them on gas/hydrogen, I think we're talking about. Now that's quite an interesting balance for me, because what I thought was we were probably going to be using hydrogen where we might have surplus because it was near an energy intensive industry cluster or something like that. So what are the conditions, both geographical and demographic, that might drive you to conclude that those places and people should continue to have home heating on gas/hydrogen rather than heat pumps or domestic heating or district heating? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, so heat networks are a good example of where you might have, for reasons of space, for instance, you might not be able to fit everybody with heat pumps. For instance, if you have lots of people living in lots of flats with confined spaces, where you might be better off having a communal heating solution, and that could indeed be driven by hydrogen if you're in a particular area where there is a hydrogen production facility.
So flats in Runcorn, yes.
Yes.
but HMOs in the centre of Leeds maybe not.
Yes, which is exactly why I think we just need to look at this region by region and work out, what are going to be the sources of energy in each of those regions, and what is the ability to have a relatively easy transition to heat pumps. And where you have households which won't be easily able to make that transition, and you have a local source, a local alternative like hydrogen, then those are the areas where it would make sense to work up that alternative.
Luke Murphy.
Doesn't the government already have all the evidence it needs to make a decision?
Yes.
Why does it need to? Why does it need to take another year?
I think, frankly, this is a matter you need to take up with the Secretary of State. I'm afraid we've probably got as far as we can in advising you on what they should be doing.
You may well just do that. Thank you very much. Vera Hophouse.
We are going back to vulnerable households. A lot of vulnerable households live in the private rented sector. A private landlord, currently has got no incentives whatsoever or no stake to actually switch to an electric heat pump or switch away from a gas network. And I really believe, we need to put our mind to that, pretty quickly. And my other question is really, and I met with Wales and West Wales and West Utilities, who are providing the gas network around my area, and they gave me a lot of food for thought. These companies need to maintain the current gas network. So the cost of doing that is an investment for the company that they might at some point not want to do, since they know that the gas network is at some point a sort of type of stranded asset. Will that not also increase the or worry you in terms of safety?
Safety is paramount for us. So when we look at the next price control that we have, then we will make sure that it's maintained as safely as it is today, and that's got to be the case for the customers who are on the gas network. And look, without again retreating towards the Secretary of State, the Secretary of State has a warm homes plan. Part of the warm homes plan will need to address the issue of what we do with the private rented sector.
Indeed. Chris Joe.
Isn't this talk about heat pumps, everybody having heat pumps or going onto hydrogen, a bit pie in the sky? I went on one of these Ready Reckoner things, which said, ask questions as to whether or not my property would be suitable for a heat pump. And I found out, first of all, it wouldn't be suitable if it was a flat above the first floor or on the first floor or above. Secondly, it wouldn't be suitable if it didn't have an area of about 6 square metres where you could actually put the heat pump outside. And there were various other conditions, including the need for a hot water tank cylinder. So how many properties do you think in the United Kingdom or in England, depending on what figures you've got, are incapable of being suitable for the installation of heat pumps? And how many of those properties do you think would then be suitable for hydrogen, which is another pie-in-the-sky idea, isn't it?
Look, and again, I hate to say this, I think there's something you need to ask the department for. The department own and run this strategy, including for households. But I just make the point that this is not just about heat pumps. This is about district heating, as well as heat pumps, and as well as hydrogen. And we do have time to work through these issues. So we are keen on a policy direction from government. There is a lot to do to make that part of the decarbonisation strategy work. But ultimately, there are options for different parts of the country.
So you haven't got you don't know how many people could have heat pumps.
So we don't plan the heat rollout. We do two things: we regulate the networks to make sure the networks are ready based on policy decisions that are made, and secondly, we run the boiler upgrade scheme, which at the moment is a demand-led scheme. So customers sign up for that, and they get the discount if they want it.
The department has got the information I'm asked for.
They do.
You think?
I have every confidence in the department.
I think we've had evidence at previous sessions about the proportion of homes that will be eligible for likely to take heat pumps, those for district heating and those for the remainder. So we will return to those.
So just one final comment. This is just a personal comment, really. We saw when we started the renewables rollout all sorts of perceived and real problems with the development of things like solar panels and wind turbines. I've sat in government departments where we found it sort of slightly eccentric, the idea that in a country like ours, solar was going to play a big part of our rollout. Now, what you see, particularly when you see the evolution of small modules, is companies innovate and they change and they adapt the service that they offer. So what is true for a heat pump today may not be true in 10 years' time.
Should we be learning from other countries? And
Absolutely right. Remember, heat pumps are not new technologies, but there are companies here who are genuinely trying to innovate, not just to tackle the building fabric issues, but also to make sure that a heat pump in your home mimics the ease and convenience of a condensing gas boiler.
Well, with that optimistic view of the future, we'll conclude the session. Can I thank you very much indeed for your evidence today. Thanks you to Charlotte Friel, to Jonathan Brearley, Tim Jarvis and Akshay, Kaul from Ofgem, very much indeed. And we will end the session there. Order, order.